It's always nice and loud and jarring. And before we begin, my name's Dr. Lani Roy. I've been the host of this network for many years now. It was the first psychedelic mental health professionals network in Australia, and when it began, it was actually quite challenging to get this approved by the department because it was still at that turning point in Australia where this was still quite a taboo topic. And, it got rejected a couple of times before it got approved. And then I just want to acknowledge the network, how supportive they've been ever since in helping to grow this network and to, promote harm reduction and science. And yeah, so just a huge thank you to the network. And before I introduce Jules, I'd just like to take a moment if we can drop into this incredible country that we're from and acknowledging the traditional owners of our lands in Australia. They're just incredible medicines that they have through music, through art, through wisdom, and being the custodians of our country. And it can be just a beautiful time to just tune into maybe somewhere in Australia that is really special to you. Might be a piece of land, with water or mountains or forest, bush, even snow, such diverse landscapes in Australia. And knowing that at any point we can, connect in and really treasure this lands in which we're all working, playing, resting, celebrating and learning together. And also acknowledging the medicines from all around the world, all the lineage holders, whether it's in the jungle or teepee, as well as now throughout our clinics and scientific labs, and making its way rapidly around Australia and the world. And may we continue to honour the sacred and the science and do so with such reverence. Beautiful. So my name is Lani Roy. I'm the network coordinator, but I'm also the chair of AMAP, which is the Australian Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Practitioners. We'll send out some information about that after the event. And we're a peak body, a not-for-profit that's really here to support and look after the professionals in this space that have worked tirelessly over the last, some decades, but particularly the last 10 years due to the boom in Australia, and to be a voice of education, harm reduction, community and connection, and really amplifying multidisciplinary interagency connection, because this work can be very fragmenting and there can be a lot of divisions. And our goal as an organisation is to really reduce stigma and be able to talk about the clinical space, harm reduction and cultural context. And also work in a lot of different settings with psychedelics and trauma. I first connected with Jules very briefly, but it was over a piece that I'd written on psychedelics, narcissistic leadership and cults. So that is our thread that initially connected us. And we will cover some of those topics today. Welcome to Jules. He's a prolific writer, incredible writer. I don't know where he gets the time. And he is just make sure I get the introduction correct, and then you can share, the Director of Challenging Psychedelic Experiences. So really spends a lot of time educating professionals and the public about the nuances and layers of altered states of consciousness and culture and the context that interacts with these medicines. And the Ecstatic Integration blog, I'll share links with all of this in the notes. And has been a journalist and BBC writer, and just an incredible, ally to the field, with a very critical lens, realistic lens, and really looking forward to unpacking some questions today. So Jules, over to you. I've made you co-host as well. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Very nice to be here with you. As Lani said, my name is Jules. I set up this non-profit called the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences Project 3 years ago to learn more about the difficulties that people sometimes experience after taking psychedelics, what kind of difficulties, and how people recover and how we can help them to recover. And I was inspired to do that from something that happened a long time ago when I was 18. My most intense period of psychedelic experimentation was like 15 to 18 in the 90s, in the kind of in that era. And I think we could probably call it a bad LSD trip when I was 18. A lot of paranoia and fear, and didn't talk to anyone about it, and then developed some various symptoms throughout university, like panic attacks, paranoia, social anxiety, nightmares, personality changes, became much more neurotic and introvert. And that was so frightening to happen to me at that age, and not know what was going on. Was I going crazy, and was it permanent? Had I permanently damaged myself? Eventually went to a therapist who said, this was after about 2 years, and the therapist said, this is just, teenage angst. You'll grow out of it. So didn't really know what they were talking about. And eventually was diagnosed with PTSD, and it took me several years to get better. So I then had a long career writing about things, like my first book was about how Stoicism inspired cognitive therapy, because Stoicism and CBT helped me recover from these post-psychedelic difficulties. Then my second book was about ecstatic experiences, these altered state experiences. How do we find them in our cultures? When are they good for us and when are they bad for us? And then I started to write about the messy aspects of ecstatic experiences. I co-edited a book about spiritual emergencies, this phrase that the Groffs developed, which is basically kind of psycho-spiritual crises. And then I set up this nonprofit. So it was remembering how frightened I was at 18. And the the Sorry, did I remove the spotlight for everyone or just for me? You put a spotlight on me, so suddenly I was looking at my own face. But anyway, my nonprofit gets emails now about 3 a week from people in post-psychedelic crises, and they're asking similar questions to the ones that really troubled me when I was 18. What's going on? Have I permanently damaged myself? How long is this going to last? Like, when does it get better? What should I do to get better? Am I possessed? Have I broken my brain? Have I, is this just PTSD? And so we're trying to help people get access to reliable information and to get some sense of what treatments reliably work for people in these post-psychedelic crises. And then to build up a body of research that can inform training, that can inform retreat centers, the underground guides, policy, so all these different things. Yeah. And then I have the Substack, which started as a side thing, which is just writing stories. And that turned into a whole big thing over the last 3 years. Sometimes about writing about instances of harm in the underground, in the overground, and causing me a lot of trouble, basically. And a lot of, I started to learn about the degree of harm in psychedelic culture, particularly, I guess, in the underground, but also in the overground. And that was fascinating to me initially, and I loved writing about it. And now, 3 years later, it's kind of wearying. It's kind of wearying and stressful to write about psychedelic misconduct and harm, because the field doesn't like to hear about it. But you obviously do, because you've come to this seminar, so I appreciate that. Anyway, that's an intro. I don't know, do you want me to do the questions, Lani, or you're going to
Yeah,
ask me the
yeah.
question?
I will ask you the questions.
Okay.
And yeah, thanks for sharing that. Thanks for sharing your lived experience. It's really important, I think, as professionals that we can share our lived experience. It's very powerful for people to hear that in the mental health space. It's still new in Australia for people, professionals to be sharing in that way. And
Uh-huh.
we'll circle back to this later, but I've been very, very blessed that vast majority of my psychedelic experiences have been really positive and incredible, even if they've been really challenging. But it has been the field of psychedelics that has been the most harmful to me.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm emerging from a bad professional trip, basically, due
Yeah.
to
Well, I can tell you
the whole
lots of stories
range.
about Lani. Yeah. I
Mm,
mean, I hear similar things of kind of people in toxic organizations.
mm.
There's just a lot of, anyway, we can get onto that
Yeah,
later.
we'll circle back to that, but it can, when we talk about harm on this network, it's not just our clients, it's also what can happen to professionals in this space. So we'll hold both of those lenses today. So what are some of the common difficulties that you've found through your work that people experience in psychedelic experiences?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we did a survey in 2023 where we asked people, have you ever experienced difficulties lasting longer than a day after taking psychedelics? If so, could you tell us about the difficulties and what helped you recover? So some people criticize the survey as confounding because we're only asking about difficulties, but it does give us a sense of the most common difficulties. I should say first, we didn't ask how common are these kinds of extended difficulties, but other surveys have. So just to look at that briefly, there was one great paper by Otto Simonson and his team. He's a fantastic researcher in Sweden that found 9% of people reported functional impairment lasting longer than a day after a difficult trip, and 3% reported seeking medical, psychiatric, or psychological assistance. 6% considered harming themselves or others. So that gives you a sense of the prevalence, and that's not bad actually compared to some other drugs, in terms of adverse effects. Likewise, in a recent Rocky Mountain Poison and Drug Safety Survey of over 2,000 psychedelic users, a quarter reported an adverse event. And of that quarter, 60% was reported physical adverse events, the most common being cardiovascular. 25% reported going to an emergency room, and 39% reported visual distortions that persisted after the effects of the drug wore off. So this gives you a sense. It's somewhere kind of around 7 to 14% of people taking psychedelics in naturalistic settings, not in clinical settings, report these kinds of extended difficulties. So in our survey, we got all, 600 responses from people describing their difficulties after psychedelics. And we did what's called a thematic analysis. So we kind of categorized them, and we narrowed it down to 50, which still seems a lot, doesn't it? 50 kind of post-psychedelic difficulties. All kinds, the full range from feeling, quite rare and unusual ones like feeling possessed to very common ones like anxiety or fear. The most common types of post-psychedelic difficulty were firstly anxiety and various types of anxiety. So there were subcategories that like fear of going mad, fear of dying, and so on. So lots of things around fear and anxiety. Another very common category was derealization and depersonalization. I guess you'll be familiar with that, like feeling disconnected from yourself or your body or from reality. Um, a third common one was existential confusion or ontological shock, but really kind of struggle with the meaning of your experience or the meaning of reality afterwards. And we can talk about that. We did another paper on that. Another was continued visual distortions. So has been sometimes called hallucination persistent perception disorder. And then finally, sleep disturbances. That can be insomnia or nightmares, or sometimes kind of reactivation when you dream. Um, so um, so those are the most common kinds of difficulties. Now, there is an interesting question being discussed in the field. To what extent should we treat some of these post-psychedelic difficulties as basically forms of PTSD? Because like heightened anxiety, sleep disturbances, existential confusion, derealization. Sorry, I also didn't mention social disconnection was one of the most common. These are all kind of symptoms of PTSD. And actually, that would make sense. When you ask, psychedelic experiences can be, as Roland Griffiths found, one of the most incredible experiences of your life, one of the top 5 most meaningful experiences of your life, most spiritual and so forth. It can also be one of the worst, if not the worst experience of your life, like, terror beyond your imagination that seems to last not just for 4 hours, but because of time distortions, it can feel like it lasts for years. So it would make sense if that would leave an imprint in the way that other truly terrifying experiences do, like a car crash or an assault or being in war. As you'll know, at the moment, to classify for a diagnosis of PTSD, I think I'm right in saying you can correct me as experts, but there have to be certain, it only gets diagnosed with certain types of events. Is that right? Like kind of, assaults or a threat to your life or something. But to my mind, a lot of these kinds of post-psychedelic difficulties could be generalized as post-psychedelic trauma. So psychedelics can heal trauma. They can also resurface trauma that people feel overwhelmed by, and they can cause new trauma.
I guess a big part of it is that existential shock, which it's very hard to prepare people for, particularly if they've had pretty rigid ways of being and knowing, or, raised in very religious ways, or, haven't actually let go of their mind. For
Yeah,
some people, that the actual existential shock is the trauma, as you're saying. And I think with PTSD, it can be real trauma, or perceived, but
yeah.
it's really irrelevant if it's been experienced on some level. So I'm curious about what you've seen in literature and your experiences around that existential shock, the harm that that can
Sure.
cause, and then,
Yeah.
what we can do to prepare people for that.
I'm putting links in as I talk. I'm
Mhm.
multitasking.
Mhm.
Um, so this is the paper I'm just putting in now on existential or ontological shock, um, which is just about to come out in plus one, I think. Um, Yeah, so we did existential confusion and ontological shock was one of the most common types of difficulties that we came across in the big survey that I posted as the first link. And so we did a follow-on paper. We interviewed 28 people who reported existential confusion after psychedelics. And we did these quite long interviews, like for about 90 minutes. And then again, we did a thematic analysis and looked for kind of similarities and so on. So you can read the full results in that paper. It's a great paper by Irini Argyri. But to generalize, as Johns Hopkins team discovered and found in various papers, psychedelics can lead to mystical type experiences. Now, when people go to retreats or to kind of illegal, that's what I mean by underground is basically illegal places, or they try psychedelics on their own, they often expect a mystical experience, which is going to be unitive, blissful, full of meaning, connecting, and they're going to come out feeling much, much better. Um, my dog's chewing the air conditioning remote. So that's the expectation, that's the hope. But that's not always what happens. People often do have mystical or religious or highly anomalous and unusual experiences, but sometimes they're accompanied with a lot of anxiety, astonishment, bewilderment, and confusion. So, for example, in the interviews we did, a young student took a fairly high dose of mushrooms on his own at university and then had an encounter with alien entities who described to him the meaning of the universe. And he's like, oh, now I understand it. But he kept forgetting and then understanding and then forgetting. And he emerged from that completely bewildered. He'd felt like, are aliens real? Was this really the meaning of the universe? Why can't I remember it? Or another person we interviewed had an experience of oneness, being one with all things. Isn't that the kind of the goal of the psychedelic mystical experience? But for him, it was actually a very depressing, disconcerting experience because if everything is one, then no one exists. No one he loves exists. Nothing he does has any ultimate meaning, not his job or his family. So for him, this experience of oneness was kind of sickening, nauseating, terrifying. Um, Sometimes people get these revelations these messages from the cosmos or from spirits. But those messages can be deeply confusing as well. A lady in, tripping in North London, she suddenly saw this glowing neon sign saying, "You are a shaman." Like, what are you going to do with that message? Like, like what you need to do, then go to the jungle and train to be a shaman. So these are the kinds of confusing experiences people can have. And that confusion about the meaning of their experience or the meaning of ultimate reality can then last for weeks or months or years. In fact, in one study we did, we looked at different kinds of post-psychedelic difficulty, how long they lasted, and which caused the most suffering and which lasted the longest. The ones that caused the most suffering were anxiety and paranoia, but the difficulty that lasted the longest was existential confusion. So this can last a long time. People's sense of reality gets destabilized. By the way, this is a cultural thing as well, because we don't have shared cultural maps for these far out altered states. For many people, this is their first experience of a kind of deep altered state. We are not we don't have much ecstatic literacy in our culture. We're not like, the Shipibo of the Amazon, where ayahuasca is a central part of their culture. So for a lot of people, they're like, I have no map for this. Where am I? I am way off the reservation. How do I get back? How can I go back to my ordinary life? So those are some of the things that happen. In terms of what seems to help people, again, we're always trying to find out what helps people recover from these things. People talked about often grounding exercises. So the existential confusion is a kind of feeling of groundlessness, like the ground has dissolved from under your feet. And it's also very dissociating from this reality. So what seems to help people is grounding back into this reality, into their body, into things like embodied practices, and into social relations. Often kind of self-transcendence can be a kind of flight from ordinary reality, a dissociation. So it's kind of getting back into the mundane. The mundane just means of this world. Um, uh, yeah, and then I can talk a bit more about in general what we found helps people recover from these things, but I'll leave it for there, Lani.
Mm.
Yeah, just
Sure.
on the kind of
Mm.
existential confusion. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's so nuanced, and you never know how it's going to land. I mean, for me personally, it was that existential shock that actually was able to crack my Christian indoctrination. I was, raised pretty uh, evangelical Christian upbringing,
right.
and it was actually those qualities of existential terror and shock, and no longer having a map for reality that ultimately freed me from that kind of culty indoctrination. Um, so and I was lost in kind of the wilderness, kind of alone in the sense, because it was before the boom in Australia, so I didn't really have access to groups and peers. So it's really fascinating how for some people that can be the ingredient that then shifts them out of um, conforming and thoughts that aren't theirs, and conditioning that was not theirs. But I guess
Yeah,
I had resources of relationship. I had good people around me. I had children and pets, and as you said, those real world 3D anchors to just hold on to while it all came together. So what for some person it might be their heaven, or it might be their hell. And as clinicians, how do we prepare people? Because you don't, ultimately it is a lot of this work. You've got to really have a lot of anchors and supports and resources, because you don't know what's going to happen. So
yeah. Well,
yeah.
you make a good point. I mean, there's so many, how the drug will interact with the person, with the setting, and with cultural factors. Like, I think probably most people who've gone through trials so far have been pretty well off, pretty educated, and probably either like secular or new age. So how would Christians going to go through it? I mean, how is it going to intersect with their belief system if they come across entities or messages or God, you know, how they interpret that. I'm the same with people, you know, Muslims as well. So I've come across challenging experiences. People encountered entities and they're like, oh, this is a jinn. And they interpreted it through the framework of a jinn, which could be kind of morally ambivalent or threatening to them.
Mm.
So, you know, it is, you know, there's so much we have to learn as these drugs become more available.
Absolutely. This wasn't a question we prepared for, but I'll just mention it. Me and my colleague, best friend Melissa Warner, a lot of our programs really designed around metacognition and helping people really prepare with, discernment. So having a lot of practice in their mind of not necessarily believing a thought and not holding on to certainty, being able to, step back, unfuse, consider
Yeah.
multiplicity. So, I guess, is there anything you want to comment around potentially how metacognition can help with existential shock as well?
Sure, yeah. So people have, you know, so first I'd say that as as other papers have found, psychedelics can lead to these quite powerful belief shifts and value shifts and identity shifts, but it's unpredictable. Like we interviewed people who became out way more spiritual. So someone who came from the army, they were atheist and they ended up in a kind of channeling group and like very spiritual. But some people came very spiritual and ended up kind of leaving spirituality because they're like, oh, that's too, you know, abstract. I'm just going to focus on the here and now. You know, I'm going to stop chasing after these big questions, stop trying to answer them, you know. So it's unpredictable how people change. I mean, there are many people who come out and they end up joining one of the mainstream kind of religions. That happened a lot in the 60s. There was a whole movement called Jesus freaks, you know. So it's unpredictable. But you're right that some of the people we interviewed talked about just they got stuck sometimes in ruminative questioning. Like, what did it mean? You know, is this the way to think about it? Is that the way to think about it? Um, you know, also if you have a bad trip, they can fixate over the trip and like go back and visit it over and over in that kind of traumatic way. And certainly some people said they learned to just let go of their need for answers and almost to just distraction and like focusing on the everyday rather than getting sucked into this kind of line of questioning where they're feeling actually I'm not getting anywhere with this, I'm not going to answer it. So there is something that sometimes draws people to psychedelics, particularly young people, which is I'm going to break on through. Finally, I'm going to understand what's on the other side, you know? And sometimes they just let go of that and go, right, I'm gonna settle back into the here and now.
Whenever anyone says break on through, I always think of The Doors, and the song comes to mind.
Yeah,
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 but yeah, I guess as you're mentioning there, with metacognition, it can be so helpful to, yeah, not take things so seriously, and that those desires, which comes from a lot of desperation, a lot of trauma, when people, a lot of the clients I work with, they were abused, they were sexually abused as children. They didn't get the opportunity to have fantasy and imagination. They were very quickly, you know, brought into the adult world, into the worst parts of the adult world. And, so they don't have that secure attachment in them. And then a lot of dissociation and fragmentation anyway. And then they want certainty because they didn't have it from a parent. And they're wanting that cosmic existential certainty. And then they can have, particularly bad trip, or they can go into a very harmful container. And yeah, that's the work that's nearly broken me, to be honest, from a client perspective, is when people have had already that context and then they enter into, you know, a harmful context in the community and existential shock. So they don't have that secure attachment anywhere. They didn't get it, the facilitators, and now they've opened themselves up to quite a discombobulating universe, and they don't really have those threads. So I guess from practitioners listening on this network is really being mindful of, the client's attachment style, do they have any of those pillars of support? I always get my clients to look at the Dan Brown ideal parent meditation and the 5 pillars of attachment. And if they don't have any of those, then, the chances of them having a bad trip is pretty high. I'll put that meditation in the show notes as well, because it's a really good one to get clients to do before medicine. You can learn a lot about them through that process. But that brings me to the next question around really the field and what you've noticed, I guess the risks and challenges in the psychedelic field. And you can discuss, we might start with facilitators, and then we'll move more into kind of organizational and cult dynamics.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to know, for one thing, because it's not always super transparent. Like most people are working in underground, by which I mean unregulated, illegal spaces. And you can't, you only get occasionally through is an article or a report or something, you get some sense of the practices of the underground. But on the whole, it's kind of hidden and it's governed by a kind of code of silence. So it's not transparent, it's not accountable. And it can, but sometimes when it emerges and someone writes about it or talks about their experience in it, you can see it's pretty wild sometimes. I mean, it's like the 70s never ended. It's, often these are kind of very boundaryless spaces. Um, and they've got a taste for the extreme. I mean, so these are extreme, the kind of extreme therapeutic or healing techniques which were big in the 70s. They're still going strong in the underground. Um,
Can you
but
give an example there, Jules?
well, take uh, there is a lineage in Gestalt therapy from Claudio Naranjo and it's sometimes called like Dionysian Gestalt. I've written about it a bit, and he had a program called Seekers After Truth, which is a very popular program, and and it's very influential in Spain. So there are maybe 60 Gestalt schools in Spain. A lot of them, run by people who've been on the Seekers After Truth program. And that program involved things like, high doses of psychedelics, multiple psychedelics, on certain retreats, multiple psychedelics on multiple days, very high doses, very little integration, people getting blown up, blown open, and then being traumatized by it. Also, a lot of nudity, a lot of polyamory, basically, you know, kind of chemsex, really. Just a lot of people on MDMA and other drugs, exploring their boundaries in this kind of 70s type way, and then going out and setting up therapy training schools. And that's what they teach, so they learn this kind of boundarylessness, this permissiveness, like all in the name of healing. And a lot of the teachers in that tradition are these kinds of men who are kind of, you know, rascal types. And that was a kind of an archetype in that lineage. Anyway, there've been, now accounts of like accusations of misconduct or assault or rape in several Gestalt schools around the world. And so you can see that, there's sometimes there are these lineages of unsafe, boundaryless, wild. I mean, that's how they think of themselves. They think it's called Dionysian Gestalt, so it's wild. And there may be people who say there should be a place for the wild. There should be a place where people can go if they want wild healing techniques, wild spiritual techniques. And I agree with that. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with people who want to do some like, you know, chemsex in the Enneagram for a weekend. That's fine as long as people know that. But sometimes people sign up for this course and they don't realize this is going to involve like um basically, group chemsex. So it's about informed consent. So
And
that's
I'll
just
add to, yeah, and I'll add to that. Agree, very much a libertarian for better or worse. Believe in these rights and freedom of consciousness and body. But I guess even just the reality is that, so many people have experienced trauma in childhood, and even those going into those containers, even if they read the flyer, they sign up, they feel like they're consenting. Consent is so variable and can change moment to moment, and the potential for dissociation and re-traumatization, is very high in these contexts.
Yeah.
So that's the reality, and that's not what's talked about.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And don't forget, these are training people to then go and be therapists. So that's risky as well, and particularly in the underground as well. So I wrote about another program called the organization called OR, and they teach a 3-year course called, now it's called Ecstatic Mysticism, and it's very high profile. It's funded by some bigwigs in the field from America, and it had this glittering roster of teachers. And it was pretty wild. I mean, they went off for these, residential retreats, and it was same kind of thing, like high doses, group kind of erotic exercises, lack of integration, and but some people really liked it, and they were very indignant when I interviewed some students who didn't, because often, like you said, they had trauma, or they just had, less of a permissive moral attitude. And they're like, what's going on here? This is going to cause harm. And they were kind of kicked out of this course for complaining. And some people love this course. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think it's okay to have wild places of out there spiritual practices of the sort that existed in the 70s. But you're absolutely right that, nowadays they need to be trauma informed. They need to be clear about things like consent, because this isn't the 70s anymore. So people are going to be really pissed off if they feel like, they got groped in a group session and they didn't give consent for that. Or if they weren't warned, okay, you're now going to be doing a high dose of MDMA or LSD or something, and they weren't held in that, and it was traumatizing for them. So there is I was thinking about this today, Lani. There's we the work that my organization does a lot follows in the footsteps of what's happened in meditation 10 years ago, where people researched adverse experiences from meditation, people having really severe side effects when they go on retreats or practice meditation at home. And people, I'm thinking particularly about an organization in the US called Cheetah House. They developed whole methods of like trauma-informed meditation. What would a trauma-informed meditation retreat look like? And we're beginning to see something similar in the psychedelic space. What would trauma-informed psychedelic therapy be? What would a trauma-informed psychedelic retreat be? But we're just beginning. So there's like about 3 or 4 teachers talking about this. I think it's something like, Bianca Seven, she talks about it, in Australia, and others do in other countries. So we're beginning, but we haven't got protocols yet or recommendations or guidelines. So that's one issue, but there's many more. I mean, just to touch on one other very briefly, I think one of the issues is, for many people working in the field, psychedelics are a sacrament. They're part of their spirituality. They're part of their spiritual identity. And that's beautiful, but that can sometimes shape how they treat clients in certain ways. For example, if you hold a spiritual belief that the medicine always knows what is good for you, and the medicine is never wrong, and whatever emerges must be for your own good because it's from this higher intelligence, that's going to affect how you treat clients. Because if a client comes to you with post-psychedelic difficulties, you might be at risk of, rather than helping the client and that being your priority, instead you're going to defend your faith. Because it's like someone saying, oh, your God hurt me. And a Christian would say, no, my God is good. My God couldn't hurt you. It must be, it's going to be good in the end. Or people can sometimes subtly, this is what I sometimes hear, people go to a therapist in the psychedelic world and they are subtly or not so subtly shamed. People in post-psychedelic difficulties already feel a lot of shame and self-blame. How could I be so stupid? Then they go to see some psychedelic guide or therapist, and the therapist or guide blames them as well and says, well, you didn't treat the medicine with respect, you were just doing it recreationally, or you're not doing the work. You're not prepared to do the work and do the integration. And this person might be in a genuine medical emergency, like severe insomnia, severe anxiety, suicidal ideation. There is a long history in this field of psychedelic guides over spiritualizing when people are in medical emergencies. Of course, you can take a spiritual frame for anything, but sometimes it's not what's needed right then. So there was a case of someone at Esalen in the 80s when Stanislav Grof was there and really developing psychedelic therapy. And they had a severe post-psychedelic crisis. And the people at Esalen, the community there said, you're having a shamanic awakening. This is a spiritual emergency. You're going to evolve into a higher sphere. You just need to complete the process, probably do more psychedelics. This would be, and then the process will reach a whole. And that person ended up getting worse and taking their own life. And this is a kind of one of those stories in Esalen that you don't necessarily hear about, but this is what can happen with these wild modalities. Um, anyway.
Yes, and I think the human race isn't very good at nuance and discernment because we can, over spiritualize medical issues and then we can over medicalize spiritual issues, and it's, this balance. And I'm connected to the ayahuasca vegetalista lineage as well as the Ashaninka lineage, and um, deep, 6-year journey with those lineages. But I sometimes I feel deeply connected to the master plants, and other times, is it all just made up? Is it just myth? Is it just legend, archetype? And I love having both. I love having that juggling of concepts and not having certainty. And I think certainty can be really dangerous. And I think you're absolutely right, as particularly when professionals find this work, and it happened to me as well. I returned from the jungle many years ago and then entered the field, with rose-colored glasses on. Even with 15 years of university, multiple degrees, it really meant nothing in that moment because it had changed me, and rose-colored glasses. So also having compassion for people in those phases, I think, because the elders in this field also need to not shame professionals that are in their own process. And because there is a lot of that goes on, where I think we need to have those leaders and elders around the world and in Australia to actually be able to walk side by side with professionals that are emerging in this space and understand that they're in process while they're supporting clients in process in a
Yeah.
culture that's in process. So yeah.
Yeah. So if you're one of these unlucky people with post-psychedelic difficulties, your life is in free form. Maybe you can't work. Maybe and you're desperate for help. You have a kind of option at the moment. You can go to someone outside of the psychedelic bubble, and they probably won't know what you're talking about, but they might still be able to help you. Maybe they'll give you some medication or some talk therapy or something. But they might shame you. They might go, "What? It sounds far out. What are you talking about?" Or you can go to someone inside the psychedelic bubble, but they could also be triggering for you by just talking in psychedelic lingo, which people inside the bubble might not realize how weird or alienating that can be for people outside the bubble, like medicine, ceremony, integration, even. Like, we're very familiar term, but that is, person at the bus stop doesn't know what integration means, shadow work, this kind of thing. And they can start, I've had people saying to me, like, looking for help, and they're like, yeah, but are they a kind of true believer? Are they going to impose their beliefs on me? Because that's very triggering for people if they feel they've been harmed by psychedelics.
Absolutely. So
That's the yeah,
meeting the person where their language is at, is really important. Um, but I want to spend some time in this next question and then move over to a group Q&A. So save the best for last, in my opinion. I'm curious of what your thoughts are on what makes up an organizational cult in this space, and also what are the types of people that are attracted to cult, maybe not even knowing that they're a part of it. What is
yeah,
that kind of pull and context that, because there are psychedelic organizational cults in Australia and around the world at varying scales. And,
yeah,
we often can't name them because the defamation laws in Australia are horrendous. So a lot of us have to work kind of covertly behind the scenes for harm reduction and to warn people. So we won't name anyone specifically, unless you're brave enough from where country that you're in. But yeah, the qualities of an organizational cult, often an educational as well, cult, and the types of people that might be attracted to that. Helpful.
yeah. So, I mean, we did a paper. I'm fascinated by it as well. I'm fascinated by cults, psychedelic or non-psychedelic, because they just raise such interesting questions about control and coercion and free will and how people can make choices that are really not in their interests, that are really harmful for them, and how they can stay in organizations for years and years that are so kind of toxic. And so people have used terms like brainwashing, which is a kind of controversial term. But certainly, if you interview people who've come out of these organizations, you're thinking something like that. Like the amount of control is incredible over their choices. And people have used terms like bounded choice or bounded free will. Like they're making free choices, but their choice architecture is totally controlled by the kind of cult leader. So they're consistently making bad choices. Um, yeah, so it's just fascinating to me, and I find it really interesting. It's also the hardest kind of story to report on. I mean, I've written about three or four kind of culty organizations. One of them, a Gestalt school in Colombia, where people were in it for like 10 to 12 years. They lost so much of their life, and there was an abusive teacher. And what astonished me is sometimes they brought their younger sisters to the teacher, knowing that this teacher was abusive, and that's incredible. Like, wow, that's control. And it wasn't like they were having a gun held to their head. So, and then I wrote about a kind of Shipibo shaman in Peru who's still running a kind of sex cult, basically, um, recruiting people from Eastern Europe to go there into the jungle, give him thousands and thousands of euros, and then do his bidding. And yeah, it's disturbing. It's really disturbing, and it's really dark, and it's a kind of it's trafficking. That's one way to think about it. Enslavement. It's human enslavement, human trafficking, and there are people who become very good at enslaving and trafficking other humans, manipulating them and coercing them. Now, so that's just cults. Psychedelics can sometimes amplify that. And it's interesting, how do psychedelics intersect with cults? So we wrote a paper, Joseph Holcomb Adams and I, about it's called Guruism and Cultic Social Dynamics in Psychedelic Organizations. And we looked basically, guruism is a feeling of kind of utter devotion for a teacher or healer or leader, a deep gratitude, and they know everything, and I'm so grateful. And that can become a process where then the teacher or leader thinks, yes, I am incredible. Yes, I do know everything. And so you get kind of devotion and submission from the follower, and then ego inflation, sometimes narcissism and megalomania from the teacher. And psychedelics can amplify that. The person giving the drugs can think, I'm very special. because they're getting all these projections onto them. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful. You are incredible. You're some kind of magus. You're some kind of channeling divine healing. And the person giving the drugs can buy into that and believe it and think, yes, I am. Take on those projections, take on that transference. And really identify with it and get ego inflated and become very, very big headed. So I wrote about one retreat where the owner of the treat decided they were Jesus and insisted that everyone who went to the treat call them Jesus. And it can also amplify the devotion, the submission, the oh my God, in the follower. So that's one thing. And then cultic social dynamics. That's kind of these dynamics that can arise in any kind of organization where basically they have a kind of utopian mission, a strong sense of some kind of cosmic purpose. They sometimes have a very charismatic leader. They have a strong sense of devotion to the leader and to the cause. They can have a strong sense of kind of conformity within the group. Maybe they wear the same kind of clothes. Maybe they adopt new names. They use the same kind of language. They have a strong sense of in-group versus out-group. We are the special ones. We're working towards this cosmic cause. Everyone else, they're kind of asleep. They don't get it. Um, and then they can sometimes feel like a family, very much a fused sense of collective identity. None of those things are necessarily bad. What I've just described, that could describe, for example, followers of the Grateful Dead. They're kind of a cult, right? That could describe CrossFit. It's kind of culty, strong sense of group identity, strong sense of a shared goal. So there's lots of things that are kind of culty, right? But not necessarily super toxic. However, those kinds of dynamics can sometimes lead to unhealthy, harmful kind of outcomes. If the leader or the group becomes very authoritarian, very controlling, or if they say we are going to minimize or silence or hide any harms that occur because the mission is so important. Have you ever come across that in psychedelic culture? Don't talk about harms, because you'll harm the movement. Will be stigmatized, will be shut down. So just shut up for now about any harms happening because we have this glorious cosmic goal. So psychedelics can amplify all of those dynamics, amplify the idea of we have a transcendent goal, we are the awakened ones, we are fused together as a family, we are following the charismatic leader. And the risk of that is it leads to this thing like, don't talk about harms. And there's a huge code of silence in psychedelic culture.
Mm.
Um,
And threats of defamation. I've never, before the field of psychedelics, I'd actually worked in, sexual abuse as a therapist for cult survivors. I've worked in government, I've worked in corporate,
yeah,
and I've never ever received a letter of defamation threat before in my life. I'm a social worker and I'm a
yeah,
psychologist. I'm always speaking out about things. And it
yeah,
wasn't until I entered this field and I was just
yeah,
going about my normal job that I
yeah,
received
yeah,
letters. And it's like, how
yeah,
interesting. And I was only speaking literally the truth
yeah,
of what many of us had experienced.
yeah.
And so guess that's something to be mindful of from a harm reduction perspective as professionals. If you're working in a organization, if that's a tool of business in this field, be very, very careful.
It
Yeah.
depends on the jurisdiction. The only cease and desist letter, the one that really frightened me I ever got was from Australia. It was from an organization called Breathless, which was reported in the Sydney Morning Herald. And because someone, a healer from one of their retreats, then ran his own private retreat, and someone then assaulted someone on his
Mm,
own private retreat. But so yes, I think Australian organizations are quite litigious.
mm,
Um, it's different in other bits. In America, there's more of the kind of free speech, First
mm,
Amendment protection. But yeah, often these things just don't, they never make it above ground. You never hear about it. You never hear about the harms because of the code of silence.
Mm. Yeah. I've added in the chat there, there's the bite model which goes through the Stephen Hassick, am I saying his name right? I'm just having a blank.
Yeah, Steve
Yeah,
Piston, yeah.
yeah, incredible. So I encourage everyone to look at that because it breaks down the different types of cults because you've got ones that are clearly more like sex cults and abuse cults, religious cults, but then there's cults of information, and that's often where in the psychedelic space you're going to find organizations that have great mission, they're talented, they've got money, they've got great programs, it looks fantastic. They've even got really good people involved because often the people don't know what's happening on the ground. And I guess that's another word of caution. If you become an advisor, really do your due diligence. There's a lot of excitement in this field. So people often sign up and start advising really quickly to places. And so the cult often has like all these really reputable people involved and they don't know that they're not on the ground. So that bite model is really helpful to look at how, yeah, cults of information and education. And then I'll also put a blog. I think this is where we first got connected, Jules, is I did a blog with some victim survivors of cults, psychedelic cults around the world. We co-wrote a blog on a whole range of things. So that can be a helpful, harm reduction resource as well. So, yeah. Is there anything else before we move into an open Q&A with the group? Is there anything else you wanted to say on that front
I would say, just to go back to something we mentioned at the beginning, like I've met a lot of people who are kind of veterans, as in not military veterans, but veterans of the space, of the industry, that have worked at several different organizations, and some have gone just from dysfunctional organization to dysfunctional organization. So there are some, good organizations, but because this is a frontier market, it's still quite Wild West. So it sometimes attracts entrepreneurs who are high risk takers, but who aren't necessarily great at building kind of careful systems of care. It can also attract first mover kind of healers who are high on confidence, but don't necessarily worry a lot about kind of harms and risks because they're so confident in their kind of healing power. Um, but I think something to keep in mind is the value of peer support and of supervision and of talking to each other in the field about, if you're working in an organization which has got some funny kind of practices or some exploitative practices, to just talk to each other. Because what can sometimes happen, and this is true particularly of retreat centers, is you've got people come in with a high ethic of care, but they're working in systems that are really just run for profit and that are run in a very kind of cowboy way by like one owner. And so the people working at these kind of retreat centers can end up getting burnt out because they're really overworked. They're doing retreat after retreat after retreat. And they also suffer moral injury because they're aware of the people are getting harmed at this place, clients, and it's just way below their ethic of care. It's not why they came into the field. They came into the field to do good, careful care. So, keep in touch with each other, talk to each other. Peer
Mm,
support is good, supervision and mentoring is good, and then knowing when to step away from an organization if it's like, okay, I can't meet the standards I expect in
mm.
this organization.
Yeah, and I
So
think
there's
it's
lots more I could say about it, but also Googling the organization, looking, like just, Google it and like criticism or whatever, or Google it on Reddit or Google it on Facebook and stuff.
mm,
Just see, have there been any scandals there?
mm.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think, a steep learning curve for me was realizing that sometimes some of your strengths as a human can also be your shadow. So, I've been in contact with a lot of narcissism in this space. And I didn't really have the education before entering this field about really what it can look like. And, my experience of narcissism in this space is often they're very, incredible people. They're very talented, they're skilled, and, often there's this hook, that draws you to them. And ironically, when you look into the literature around narcissism, they're most likely to target people who are forgiving, who can hold multiple perspectives, because you're often more tolerant and you're often more understanding of people's suffering and bad behavior, and also, you know, uh, want connection. So often, the things that in this space that you bring that are really good qualities can actually really draw you in to these organizations. And I guess we didn't get to cover it, but really breaking down that stigma. Good people can end up in cults. Really good ethical people can end up in really toxic organizations, and it's those good qualities that draw them in. So, really breaking down that stigma. If you know someone that's been in a psychedelic cult or been in a really toxic work organization, is actually, extra shame doesn't help. And, trying to have a little bit of that understanding of what drew them in the first place. And yeah, as you said, harm reduction, do your research, talk to elders, leaders in the field. And, I say to people now in supervision is know your non-negotiables, write them down. So when your morals are starting to be compromised and broken, you've done that piece of work. You can see, okay, I'm starting to say yes to things that are a no. I'm starting to, because at the coercive control and the dissolving of those moral fibers, they happen very, like, quite insidious. And unless you've got someone watching and holding that in supervision with you and tracking your
Yeah.
codes. Yeah.
I don't trust the elders in the space. I've got to tell you,
Mm,
like I just
mm,
went to a psychedelic safety summit and it was all these elders and like I'd written about 20% of them
mm,
and they were wafting around like they were kind
mm,
of super magi.
mm,
And I was like, I know the harm you guys have caused and the arrogance,
mm,
I'm speaking as that as someone, who's one removed. I guess I'm there, but
mm.
I'm wary.
Of
Uh,
course. Yeah.
but
Mm,
but yeah, you're right. But also, and anything like research, I've heard people who worked at research centers who
mm,
felt there was weird culty dynamics there. Like I'm
mm.
talking
Of course. It can happen anywhere.
FDA
Yeah.
research centers, training organizations, sometimes
Mm,
churches, non-profits. So,
mm,
and that's really because we're talking about human dynamics,
mm.
but
And
but yeah,
have people that are not in the field that you're getting supervision with have, when I say
yeah,
elders, have elders that have nothing to do with this space, you know, is
yeah.
helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Mm,
Right.
mm.
Yeah, just it can be really helpful to talk to people outside the bubble.
Yes,
Um,
definitely.
yeah, yeah.
All right, let's get to some questions. That was awesome. Thank you. So if anyone's got a question, you can put it in the chat or you can just raise your hand and we'll navigate that. Do you need a check on your dog, Jules? I
No.
actually came to my friend's house to get away from my French
Oh,
bulldogs called Magic and
that's
Mushroom because they are like entities that I need space from. So yeah.
it was a pop.
If you can see anyone's hands go up, just let me know. Don't be shy. We've got this time to use together, guys. Feel free to, yeah,
Yeah, I raised my hand. Can I ask a question?
go for it.
Firstly, just thank you both for this webinar. I really enjoyed this healthy dose of skepticism in a space that's full of lots of positive gung-ho attitudes towards psychedelics. Obviously, they're very, or can be really wonderful, but it's good to understand the wide range of experiences and the risks involved. So thank you. My question is for you, Jules. And Lani too, I'm very fascinated by the intersection between the beliefs that people bring into an experience, the spiritual beliefs, as you mentioned, and then how that shapes the experience itself. It sounds like you've looked into that to some degree. I mean, is it the case that if someone comes in and they're Christian and they see Jesus, and if they're a Buddhist, they see Buddha, or that kind of thing? Like, to what degree do you see a linear mapping between what I think going in about spirituality, about gods, about entities or beings, and then what happens. Does it sort of map, or is there variance where they'll be totally different from what they were expecting?
I I haven't studied that precise question, but it comes up, I guess, in some of the interviews we've done. And my sense is, yeah, variance. So sometimes people go into a trip with certain expectations or something in their mind, and it just amplifies that. Um, you know, so um, but sometimes the setting can create a certain type of experience. So mystical type experiences are more reported on the west coast of the US than on the east coast, and they're more reported in the US than in Europe, which is more kind of secular. If you go to a certain retreats, there's some retreats might have a neo-shamanic kind of frame, and then people are more likely to encounter plant spirits on their, trips because they're expecting to. But then also you just get wild cards sometimes. People get, they're not Christian at all and Jesus turns up, or they're not Muslim at all, or Hindu, and suddenly there's Hanuman or something. So that's the sense I get anecdotally. What do you think, Lani?
Oh, I love this topic, and I've just finished my research with Swinburne on the Australian ayahuasca Deotero community, and publishing some of that work soon. And I'll circle back with a webinar later this year, because we coded the different religious and spiritual identities, and then this was only one aspect, but then looked at how people spoke and languaged their experiences. And it's so beautiful to see in this community in particular that people, because there was total freedom of choice. There's the lineage, but ultimately there's multi-instrument, multi-prayer, there's multi-faith, there's no alliance needed. So people were free to completely be themselves. And then what we saw in the literature is like the fusion and merging of animism with Judaism, or animism with Greek Orthodox, and people being able to then reinterpret their religion through the lens of ayahuasca, and then still go back to church and still even be pastors in churches through an ayahuasca lens. So I guess I've seen it done really, beautifully, and the healthiest kind of medicine altars, for a word, will support individual expression and fusion of multi-faith religions and spiritualities. And that's what I personally love. So I have access to all of these lineages, but I actually don't really believe or hold on to any of it. It's kind of, yeah, just I don't need that anymore. So I think that's incredible. But also, I guess from a risk perspective, is when people go in with a frame, as Jules has said, like plant medicine, the plant spirit told me, that can literally be, I've had women that I've supported, the medicine has told me that I'm going to marry that man. The plant told me. I'm like, no, it didn't. You want that, and you have projected that onto the psychedelic landscape, and people get really hurt and disappointed. So as I teaching most, even the children that I work with who are not in the psychedelic space, have a little question mark, doesn't have to be one of paranoia or skepticism, but like just a healthy little psychedelic question mark that can keep you going, okay, yeah, let's just keep open. It doesn't have to be certain, it doesn't have to be locked in. And I think any religion that has such certainty, some people can struggle. They get that ontological shock because, yeah, they need to let go of that certainty, in my opinion. Yeah. Hope that makes sense.
There was a question in the questions, which was, as a psychologist coming across a client with a challenging experience, what is some positive language we can use to diffuse shame? Can you direct to literature? Well, so I can say that we run a peer support group for people with post-psychedelic difficulties online last Sunday of the month. And we ask people what they find helpful or unhelpful afterwards. And I think the thing people find most helpful from that is like, you're not alone. Like someone else has been through severe post-psychedelic difficulties, probably someone else with the same kinds of difficulties that you're going through. So they're really freaked out, like someone who contacted me last week, severe insomnia after a kind of mushroom trip, and I connected them to someone else who had severe insomnia after a mushroom trip who'd come through it. So this person could, first of all, there's that, oh, you're not alone, and other people have experienced severe difficulties and they've come through them, because the real fear is, I've broken myself and I'm not going to get better. Like I'm in a different reality. I'm a different person. It's awful, and I'm going to be stuck here forever. So they're in real fight or flight. They're really like activated, and in a way they need to accept and relax and accept something bad happened to them, and get out of that kind of catastrophizing which they're stuck in. But anyway, so kind of, you're not alone. Others have been through this and they came through it. And if you can then even share stories of other people who've been through these kinds of problems, that's something that people say to us. One of the things that people said is most helpful to them is like self-education. So they find other stories. We now have a section on our website, Challenging Psychedelic Experience Project, just stories of recovery. And we put interviews sometimes on YouTube, and people contact me and saying that was so helpful. That's just like my story. So so that's one thing. You're not going mad, because that's another big fear they have. And then as to the kind of self-blame and shame, like, it's not your fault. You were just trying to heal, or you're trying to kind of expand your mind. So you were unlucky. Like, that wasn't a stupid decision. People have good decisions. Unfortunately, like, a percentage have difficult experiences, but it's quite a, it's 9%. So you were in that 9%, and maybe there were some factors that made you more likely to, but it wasn't your fault. And now let's focus not on the past, but on the present and on the future. What's going to help you now? Because people can get stuck in the past, like, really grieving for their lost self. Like, when I was 18 to kind of 25, I couldn't get over what had happened to me, and that I'd lost my like happy self and my easy life, and I'd blown it, so I couldn't get over that, and I couldn't accept the present. I couldn't accept my present self, because actually my personality had changed. I'd become more introvert and more neurotic and more sensitive and all that, bad stuff, as it were. That's what it seemed like to me at 23. So I had to grieve. I had to go, that's happened. Something bad has happened to me. Like I'd been in a serious accident, almost like I'd severely injured myself, or been an amputee, or gone through cancer or something, or got divorced. Something really hard has happened, and now I have a choice. Am I going to accept the present and live my life, or am I going to basically die? But so clients are in that kind of thing. They're grieving for a lost self and a lost reality. And then how can one help them to move to a place of acceptance and eventually healing? Yeah.
Beautiful. I'll just do a little
Yeah.
segue there, Jules. So also IFS can be helpful for people working through shame, helping people to have, compassion for those shameful parts, because sometimes people need to face their own shame. Well, the medicine can show them, actually, you may have harmed people. You may have really, sometimes there's action and responsibility, a call to responsibility, and they need to be actually, supported to rectify and heal their own personal shadow. And then just, Deanne, I won't recommend any retreat centers here, just because I personally think in a group setting, each retreat is so different. Every person's different. So I tend to not do any recommendations, sweeping recommendations of retreats, because it's just such a nuanced conversation for each person to work through. And we'll go over to Adam if you want to ask your question.
Sure. So thank you, Lani and Jules, as well, for the chat. My question is, and Jules, you just kind of touched on it with the book you just sent in, but I guess the ethics of like appraising an experience or a psychedelic experience as psychosis or emerging schizophrenia or a spiritual emergence or emergency, and like how to go about that and what is best practice. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So I'm not a psychiatrist, so I've never had to deal with that kind of question. But I did edit a book of people's stories, 14 people's stories, who'd had psycho-spiritual extended crises, some after meditation, some after psychedelics. And they found the frame spiritual emergency helpful to them in their eventual recovery. The phrase spiritual emergency was developed by the Groffs. And there, I now, 4 years after this book came out, have some issues with it, because in a way, what the Groffs were trying to do was demarcate certain forms of, how do you say it, kind of extreme mental states from psychosis, and basically say these are a kind of psycho-spiritual crisis, but they're actually part of an awakening, whilst all these things, that's just psychosis. And actually, it's hard to draw such a firm line. So often manic states or psychotic states have spiritual aspects to them for people. So it's hard to draw the line and say, oh, that's psychosis, but that's a kind of psycho-spiritual crisis. It's also the case that sometimes the same things help people recover from messy, extreme psycho-spiritual crises and manic episodes and psychotic episodes, like connection, support, trying to ground, trying to slow your mind down, maybe medication if necessary, but also finding a frame of meaning. That's the bit that maybe psychiatry sometimes leaves out. Like, they just tell people to ignore all their experiences, all their symptoms, all the content, but people often do find it very meaningful. And it's a mistake to say that has no meaning to it, because you're talking against their experience. So that means there's going to be a schism in their mind between, oh, this is mental health care, but yet they'll be drawn back to their experience a bit, because like, what did it mean? It was kind of meaningful. What was that weird thing? And so it's better to kind of say, yeah, there can be meaning to it and stuff, but you can still also, you don't necessarily want to go back there. You can still try to regulate it and, like, have a more normal functioning life without denying the meaning of that episode. Anyway, maybe one distinction one can make is that people in full-on mania or psychosis often have very little insight into it, into that what's happening to them could be a kind of manic episode or a psychotic episode. It's all kind of happening to them. It's all the outside world. It's what the Illuminati are trying to do to them, or it's what their horrible family are trying to do to them. So there's a very little insight. Well, sometimes, so that's one kind of variable.
Yeah, persecutory.
Yeah, it's all a story happening to them. Whilst sometimes with people with a higher level of insight recognize that this might be some kind of internal process that they're going through. So that's one kind of variable, and that can change over time. So someone can build up their insight that this is something that's happening, that this is something I can navigate. So that's part of what healing is, isn't it? Is recognizing a growing sense of insight. Anyway, so yeah, and then whether it's constant, frequent episodes, or if this is a kind of one-off episode, or maybe a couple of episodes. So with, my mum has bipolar, and when she developed it, she would have a manic episode every year for like 2 to 3 months. whilst I might have a tendency to that, genetic tendency, but I've only had like one or two kind of meltdowns in my life, usually after psychedelics, and so I don't know. You can label it, but she seems to require more kind of regular medication. But who knows? I mean, now I'm getting into kind of treatment pathways, and really, I'm way beyond my expertise.
Sorry, getting distracted with links. This next question is an interesting one. I'll just say something very briefly. Thanks, Adam, for that. I know you've got a really deep passion for those types of questions, and that's like a whole nother webinar series we could go down. It's just, yeah, really important though. And because there are a lot of clients out there that have psychosis and schizoid affective disorder that are working with psychedelics as well, and that's real, that's happening. I've seen it done okay. I've seen it done, actually, yeah, it can be done, but then it's of huge risk and can be absolutely devastating. So all those variables, and as practitioners, not just telling a client that walks in the door that they shouldn't do it, really having that expanded discussion with them, because they have a right to explore their options, even if it's potentially really dangerous. Don't shut that down. So many of them get shut down and then they just go and do it anyway. So keep that container open. Gertruda wrote, how can we trust each other in the field and our clients? Can we make agreement on, protocol, ingredients, self-care, set settings, sitting, integration? What I will do a shameless plug here for what AMAP did for our credentialing pathway. And I'm very much open to feedback. I'll put this in the show notes, but when we designed our credentialing pathway, we looked at all the courses around the world, everything that everyone was doing, and distilled what a preliminary psychedelic therapist should look like, what a fully accredited psychedelic therapist should look like, and what a supervisor should look like, to the best of our ability at this time. And instead of endorsing courses, so we don't endorse courses, we endorse individuals that have a range of qualifications, university degrees, have gone and done somatic work, hard science education, harm reduction, cultural knowledge. So the policy actually, it's a good start. And we spent a lot of time, a lot of consultation. Bianca was on the steering committee at the time. And, there is no one size fits all course. It's not that simple. But, Janice Phelps does talk about a range of therapist competencies, and they really ring true. And that's another article we can add. And I think AMAP's given it a real go to kind of capture what are the core skills, and wisdom or aspiration for wisdom, spiritual intelligence, embodiment, grounded, capacity to not be certain, and then all these other modalities have been put into that policy. So yeah, that's what I'll say on the matter. But do you want to add anything to that, Jules?
I would say, America has really struggled to develop agreed standards, because it's not really legal yet. And so I think there may be some kind of agreed standards in Oregon and Colorado, but even that has been hard because it's still emerging, but they're certainly not at the national level. There was an organization called APA set up and given lots of money to try and develop kind of these agreed standards, agreed ethics codes, and it didn't work, and funding got pulled because it's hard to know yet. Once some kind of medicines have been approved by the FDA, there will be protocols for that particular treatment, like MDMA assisted therapy or something. So, and in Europe, even less. We're nowhere near some kind of so it's great that you have, because that has proven really hard. It's been proven really hard to develop trade associations in psychedelics. I don't know. Well, I guess because it's mainly illegal. So they've hardly any trade. It's also because sometimes people in psychedelic culture, particularly in the US, but maybe also in Australia, and in other places, I don't know, there can be a lot of drama, right? And feud and that kind of thing. So that's certainly the case in the US. So it's been going for decades, and they haven't developed these standards. They haven't developed these you know shared frameworks. That people are attempting to do that now. But anyway, I think it's great that you have in Australia and other things as well. Like you developed a kind of a registry of outcomes. I'm glad to see that. And it's, I suppose it goes to show that when you legalize treatments, it enables this kind of professionalization.
But also, I think we've got to always be conscious and cautious of who's setting up the guidelines, what lens, what I guess vested interest do they have, who are the knowledge holders? Because if you look at the DSM, for better or worse, it has a lineage of being set up by, white middle class, above middle class men, so we have to, it's not only, let's get these guidelines out. It's like, let's be really critical about who's setting them up, how are they benefiting, what money's involved, who's funding them. Like there's so many layers. So yeah, that's why AMAP has chosen not to back organizations, but to back the individual based on a set criteria.
And you're never going to get everyone to agree to them because there's so many different ways people do psychedelics. They're kind of medical to the sacramental, therapeutic, psychiatric. And so that's, I guess, another massive complication for the field.
Well, we're on time, and I'm respectful of everyone's time and yours. But I, could have talked for hours because this is, incredible work that you're doing and wealth of knowledge. So encourage everyone to look up Jules and his work and sign up to his blog, which is, the only blog that I actually am interested. I don't know. I don't really connect with a lot of blogs for some reason, but your one is, very deep, very detailed and very on point. So that's my shameless plug to you. And looking forward to connecting again, at some point on this network or in other ways. And yeah, everyone, I will send out some stuff on AMAP. We've released a massive position statement on the field of psychedelics in Australia with some pretty senior advisors. It took months of work. Would really love your feedback. We would want that peer review if we've missed anything. We really value your feedback, and yeah, look after yourselves and each other, which is what Jerry Springer said, but he was onto it. And hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
See you guys.